Eagles Entertainment.
With the 10th pick in the 2021 NFL Draft, the Philadelphia Eagles select...
You're listening to the Journey to the Draft podcast.
Welcome to the Journey to the Draft podcast, presented by Life Brand. I'm your host, Fran Duffy, and it's finally here. Our Journey series debuts today as we look back at the Eagles' first-round pick, DeVonta Smith's journey from college player to draft prospect to becoming a Philadelphia Eagle, with all of our analysis every step along the way right here on the show over the last couple of years. First, this is going to be a very Eagles-centric show, so for our non-Eagles fan audience, don't worry. We will be back to talking about your team in no time. We're continuing our breakdowns of every single class around the NFL right here on the show. So stay tuned for those right here on the Journey to the Draft podcast. To our Eagles fans, if you are not already, be sure to go subscribe to this podcast. If you're just checking it out to hear the analysis and the interviews about DeVonta Smith, I'm here to tell you now, you do not need to wait. If you were subscribed all year long, you would have heard all of this analysis over the last couple of years on DeVonta Smith, and you would have been well equipped with your own opinions on the Eagles' decision to trade up and make him the 10th overall pick in April's draft. We are talking about prospects all across the country, all season long, and you can get that analysis to your podcast device just by hitting that subscribe button. So if you aren't already, be sure to do so. And while you're here, throw us your review. Throw us a rating. We really appreciate that. It certainly helps us in terms of trying to find more people looking for podcasts just like this one. That being said, let's get this episode rolling. Let's jump back in time here to hear more about DeVonta Smith and his journey to Philadelphia.
Now it's time for Draft Buzz.
Fires to the end zone. Touchdown! Alabama wins! The Crimson Tide will not be denied. True freshman to true freshman. Tagovailoa to DeVonta Smith.
That was Monday, January 8th, 2018, overtime of the national title game as the legend of Tua Tagovailoa is born. But while all of the attention went to Tua in that moment, little did we know that it was going to be the launching point for one of the most productive receivers in the history of college football. That was DeVonta Smith's only catch of the game, one of just 8 on the season for the true freshman out of Amite, Louisiana, and it went for 41 yards for that game-winning touchdown. Smith finished that 2017 season 10th on the team in receiving on a depth chart littered with future first-round picks, potential NFL stars, but as is the case with Alabama, tides of change would be felt in the offseason. The team's leading receiver, Calvin Ridley, moved on to the NFL, and he was not alone, as offensive coordinator Brian Daboll would also be joining him, taking a job with the Buffalo Bills. Alabama had 12 players drafted that April, including Ridley, and with that shakeup on offense, there were a lot of snaps available for the taking. So that fall, DeVonta Smith would start 10 of 14 games as a sophomore for Alabama and the new offensive coordinator, Mike Locksley, and he quickly became a much bigger piece of the offense. He was one of just 5 players on that unit to have at least 40 catches on the season, but still, he finished behind Jerry Jeudy, Jalen Waddle, Henry Ruggs, and the tight end Irv Smith Jr. in receiving. Jeudy was the talk of the college football world at receiver. He was named a consensus All-American. He won the Fred Biletnikoff Award as the top receiver in the country for the #1 team in the nation. But Smith was still somewhat of an unknown quantity. Here on the Journey to the Draft podcast, we prepared to preview that 2018 title game, one of many showdowns between Clemson and the Crimson Tide. One of the matchups I was most excited about personally was that Alabama group of pass catchers against a star-studded Clemson secondary that was also full of future NFL talent. Here's what I had to say back previewing the 2018 title.
It's just incredible that these teams are here in the championship game again, considering the turnover every year with the rosters, the coaching staff. This isn't like the Warriors where you just re-sign Durant and Curry every year and you have the same team for 5 straight years. These are literally different teams every year, and you're still this dominant, and we're meeting for a round 4 in national championship.
And that's what's crazy is, like, and this segues perfectly into my next matchup because it's these Alabama receivers against the Clemson secondary. You come into last week's game and you're like, all right, you know about Jerry Jeudy. He wins the Biletnikoff and all that. Jalen Waddle had made plays all throughout the year. Henry Ruggs III, the guys can just fly. First play of the game, DeVonta Smith, 50 yards, slant route, almost takes it to the house. And it's like, who is DeVonta Smith? Right. And then he goes, he's the leading receiver for the game. They got Irv Smith Jr. running around out there. Like, they just have all these guys that just make plays. That's why, to me, that's the difference between this Alabama team and the other Alabama teams, is that they've got this dynamic level of offensive firepower that I don't know how Clemson's going to match up.
Of course, and it shows what I know, Clemson and freshman quarterback Trevor Lawrence would go on to shock the Tide and win that game. But isn't it funny? Despite Smith catching that game-winning touchdown the year before, he was still lost in the shuffle a little bit in that discussion going into that game. He ended up with 6 catches against Clemson in the loss, second only behind Judy, who was also just a true sophomore. And like I said earlier, he was the Blitnikoff Award winner, consensus All-American. He was the name in that Alabama group of receivers. Now, the scary part about that Tide offense that offseason was after the loss to Clemson, they had some turnover like every other year. Mike Loxley, the offensive coordinator, he would move on to be the new head coach at Maryland. Star running backs Josh Jacobs, Damian Harris, they went on to be drafted. Their left tackle, Jonah Williams, he goes in the first round of the draft. The tight end, Irv Smith Jr., he goes in the draft in the second round. But outside of that, the large majority of that pass game was retained. Tua Tagovailoa, he was back for another season. All of those receivers, Judy, Ruggs, Waddle, and DeVonta Smith, were all returning. But this time, with a new offensive coordinator, as Nick Saban would bring back Steve Sarkisian to run the offense after a stint as the offensive coordinator for the Atlanta Falcons in the NFL. So, once again, the scheme would change in Tuscaloosa as DeVonta Smith entered his junior year, one that would prove to be very pivotal for him. Smith started every single game that season, leading the Tide in receiving yards as a junior, ahead of Jerry Jeudy, ahead of Henry Ruggs, and ahead of Jalen Waddle. Early on in that season, I caught up with ESPN host and Philadelphia native Kevin Negandhi here on the show, and I asked him a simple question. When you look around the college football landscape, all the top teams were loaded with wide receivers from top to bottom. So, if he had to pick one group of pass catchers, which one would he pick?
Fran, this is a really tough question because I think I've mentioned a couple of groups, but I'm half joking here that I could probably throw for 200 yards if I had Alabama's crew. Because what those kids do, Judy's going to be a top 5 pick because of his route running, right? And you look at Ruggs, and you look at the idea of DeVonta Smith, who would be a number 1 on any other team in the country, right? And then Waddle's still on that team. These guys are all 4'3", 4'2", flirting with that in the 40s. All 4 of these guys I just mentioned. And they all look like they're the prototype new kind of wide receiver, right? And they're just so darn good. And you just sit there and you're like, man, when did Alabama... Now, granted, they've had a lot of success with Julio Jones through the years and Calvin Ridley, but when did they become suddenly a factory of wide receivers that we're normally seeing from LSU and Clemson and Ohio State? Now you have Alabama in that conversation.
Now, later in that conversation, I asked Kevin, is there a player that he would love to see end up in Philadelphia a few months later for the 2020 NFL Draft? One of the players he focused on, well, you could probably guess who it was. It was DeVonta Smith.
I think there's a couple ways to go here, right? And it depends on where the Eagles fall in the draft in that first round. But, man, I think they need speed at the wide receiver position. They need young speed. And whether that's, Henry Ruggs if he's available, whether that's DeVonta Smith if he's available. I love Chenault's size. I love Higgins' size out of Clemson. That's the one thing, though, that you're going to get from DeVonta Smith, and all right, we have a burner down the field who is young and who's going to separate, because that's the key that this offense has been missing. When you lose Torrey Smith, you don't have somebody spreading things out. It crushes what you want to do underneath.
So that was a hell of a premonition there from Kevin Negandhi. Now, that 3-headed monster of Jerry Jeudy, Henry Ruggs, DeVonta Smith, they would have been the talk of the country any other season in 2019. But you had the undefeated LSU Tigers, future number 1 pick Joe Burrow. They beat the Tide in a classic battle on a Saturday night in the middle of the college football season as Tua Tagovailoa struggled fighting through an injury. In that game against LSU, Smith had 7 catches for 213 yards and a pair of scores, and he did it despite being matched up against the freshman phenom corner, Derek Stingley, who was an All-American. I think he won the Thorpe Award that year as a true freshman, and DeVonta was matched up against him for a majority of that game. Smith had officially arrived on the national scene, and while all of the buzz continued to surround Jerry Jeudy and Henry Ruggs, Smith's name was on the tongue of scouts and media analysis, really as the season went on. Matt Zenitz, who at the time covered just Alabama, but now covers the entire SEC for AL.com, posted an article featuring quotes from anonymous NFL scouts about the biggest stars on the Alabama roster. One of those players featured was DeVonta Smith. We talked about that right here on the show. Wide receivers Jerry Jeudy, DeVonta Smith, Henry Ruggs, all together lumped in. I would think all three of these guys go top 60, one scout said, but I'm not sure any of them go top 20. It's a deep draft for receivers, another scout said. I've talked to some other scouts about how teams will be hesitant to take a receiver early because they know they can still get one. There's going to be a lot of receivers on the board in the second and third rounds. The crazy thing about DeVonta Smith is that he could end up being the best one out of all of them, another scout said. He's got great hands. He's a great route runner. He's got a knack for making big plays. He's not fazed by situations in games. He's versatile and can play any receiver position inside or outside. He checks off all the boxes except for his size. Respect for DeVonta Smith was building, and it was clear that he was on his way to being a top NFL prospect. Soon after that article dropped, I had a chat with our friend Dane Brugler right here on the show before he became a weekly fixture here on the Journey to the Draft podcast, of course, and he had just written that week that DeVonta Smith and that Alabama offense, they were a force to be reckoned with. Here's what Dane had to say late in the fall of 2019. And you also mentioned the other Alabama receiver in that article, and you wrote a little bit about DeVonta Smith. And one of the things you wrote about him was the more you watch DeVonta Smith, the more you run out of reasons why he shouldn't be considered in round one. So we're talking about three potential Alabama receivers in the first round of this draft. Talk about Smith and what grades him ahead of some of these other talented receivers in this class.
When you watch the receiver position as an evaluator, it boils down to two things: can you get open? Can you catch the football? And that's what DeVonta Smith does exceptionally well. He's able to beat press coverage. He can create his own spacing down the field, and he has the best ball skills on that Alabama roster with all those talented wide receivers. So for a guy with the ability to get open, to separate, and then those ball skills, you're going to bet on those traits. And so it's such a loaded position.
So the regular season wraps up, and at that point, it was pretty much consensus in every mock draft out there that DeVonta Smith was basically our late first-round pick if he would have decided to enter the draft. That decision would come later, but first, Alabama had a bowl game to play. With the loss to LSU, they didn't play in the SEC title game, so they did not go to the college football playoff that year. Instead, Alabama would square off against Jim Harbaugh and the Michigan Wolverines in the Citrus Bowl. ESPN had that game, and before the big matchup, I was happy to bring on ESPN analyst Tom Luginbill, who also brings extra insight because he studies these guys going all the way back to high school in recruiting. And I asked him to look at these three Alabama receivers, Smith, Jeudy, Ruggs, and tell us what separates each of them from each other. What made Jerry Jeudy great? What made Henry Ruggs great? And what made DeVonta Smith great? Here was his answer.
I think separation, leveraging opponents, attacking a defender's alignment, eating up cushion, all of these different little nuances, the things that made a Steve Largent great. Like if you put a Steve Largent into Antonio Brown's talent, what would you have had? So I think that's what makes Jerry Jeudy unique, because it's easy for him. Those are things that are innate. I think Henry is the fastest. I think DeVonta Smith is the most fluid of the three in terms of natural wiggle. I mean, he's like a human rubber band. I worry a little bit about him in terms of overall durability. He's built like a taller Deshaun Jackson, maybe a little bit more fluid in his overall movement. So it's interesting because when you watch him in person, you can tell he can run, right? But I don't think you realize truly how fast he is until people are on his heels, because he's so weavy and wiggly that it's hard to kind of gauge what he's doing. Whereas Henry Ruggs, boom, he's 25 miles an hour down the sideline.
Now, in that episode, Ben Fennell and I also previewed that game. Ben worked on the same crew as Tom that entire season, so Ben got the chance to see DeVonta Smith up close multiple times that year. He gave insight all season long on that entire Alabama team. Alabama goes on to win that game pretty handily, and soon afterwards, on January 6, 2020, DeVonta Smith announces that he will return to Tuscaloosa for his senior season. Jeudy and Ruggs would go on to declare for the draft, as would Tua Tagovailoa, and once again, it was going to be a new-look offense for the Tide in 2020. But it was pretty clear that Smith was going to be the focal point. The draft comes and goes. Both Ruggs and Jeudy get drafted, with the speedster Ruggs going off the board first in a little bit of an upset to the Las Vegas Raiders. Jeudy got drafted a couple of picks later by the Denver Broncos, but both went in the top 15. Fast forward a couple of months It's the middle of August, and here on the show, we are previewing the top prospects for the 2021 NFL Draft in the entire SEC. In that episode, we did a category where we discussed the top seniors on both sides of the football, and Dane Brugler's top senior entering the year in the SEC, of course, it was DeVonta Smith.
I went with DeVonta Smith, wide receiver from Alabama, who, I wasn't sure how much I was going to like him because nothing about his height, weight, speed screams playmaker, especially his weight. He's right around 170, 175, but this guy's ball skills are unbelievable. His ability to separate, he's very savvy. In 3 years at Alabama, he has only 4 drops. Remarkable catch rate. So he will not put the ball on the ground. The ball skills, the hands, he's very aggressive. He's a lot tougher than he looks, a lot tougher than what you would expect from a 170-pound wide receiver. And so I'm a big believer in DeVonta Smith and how he's going to translate. So as long as you can look past that lack of intimidation factor because of his size, I mean, this guy, as a route runner, there's no wasted motion in and out of his breaks. That short area quickness, he can shake press, get open. Good luck just leaving him one-on-one in coverage because he will be able to create his own separation downfield. To me, I saw a more dynamic version of Tyler Boyd, came out of Pitt, now with the Bengals. A more dynamic version of that, can play inside, outside. This is a really good wide receiver class. We talked about Jamar Chase, but I don't know how you can't include DeVonta Smith in your top 5 wide receivers this year. I mean, there's some good ones with, Rondale Moore, who we've talked about, Rashad Bateman we talked about. We'll be talking about a few more receivers today in this conversation, but DeVonta Smith, to me, I'll take him on my team any day.
Due to COVID-19, the season started a little bit later than normal, so we did not see the Tide take the field until the last week of September. Alabama was breaking in a new starting quarterback in Mac Jones, and to start the year, Smith rolled off 8 catches for 89 yards against Missouri. Followed that with a 6-catch performance for 63 yards against one of the SEC's top defenses in Texas A&M. Now, you get to week 3 against Ole Miss. DeVonta breaks out. Smith racked up a team-high 13 catches for 164 yards and a touchdown against the Ole Miss Rebels, a team that he had scored 5 touchdowns against the year before as a junior, and this game really kind of got the numbers rolling last fall. The following week, Alabama squares off against those rival Georgia Bulldogs, and this was a game that everybody in the college football world had circled on their calendars. Georgia had prospects at every corner of their defense, including a couple of future top 40 picks at corner in Tyson Campbell and Eric Stokes. We talked about that matchup that week leading into the game with multiple guests, myself, Ben, and Dane. We talked about it. That was going to be the big matchup. Alabama's receivers, DeVonta Smith and Jalen Waddle, going up against Campbell and Stokes. DeVonta Smith in that game finishes with 11 catches for 167 yards and 2 scores. His presence was felt, and we talked about his performance the following week as one play in particular stood out to Ben Fennell.
We might as well stay with SEC receivers down here, and we'll go DeVonta Smith. Huge game against Georgia and some of those big physical corners that I was a little bit worried about. I didn't think that was a good matchup for DeVonta Smith, and he had a nice touchdown catch 2 plays earlier, forced a DPI that I thought was great coverage by Eric Stokes. I thought he squeezed him right out of bounds, and that was kind of my tweet coming of saying, this is my issue with DeVonta Smith. If he can't win on his release, can he maybe get bullied because he's only about 175 pounds? But he lined up in number 3 on his touchdown. Looked like he was working to the corner. Savvy Mac Jones threw him a little back shoulder. The DB wasn't looking. He just plays so much bigger at the catch point than his 175-pound frame would suggest. I think he snatched the ball away. Stokes was in good spot, didn't look for the ball, rather played through his hands. And Smith said, no, you're not raking this ball out of me. And that's what he's done throughout his career. So physical and competitive at the catch point. Love to see that. And then when they were up comfortably, 2-3 scores, he caught a little bubble screen and absolutely trucked Richard LeCount for an 8 or 9 yard gain where LeCount just goes flying 2 or 3 yards. I just wanted to tack on that one more play because he shows you time and time again he will play stronger than his frame and weight may suggest.
This spring for scouts, he was 170 pounds and he ran a 4.52. Now, give him some training. Maybe he, gets down to the 4.4s and, have a big breakfast. He'll get up to 175. But that's just, on paper, this guy is not who you want. But you watch the film and he's exactly who you want. So it really will be an interesting conversation. And, above all, I'm going to trust the tape. But yeah, I definitely think I agree with you, Fran. There will be teams that kind of look at that and say, well, okay, I mean, we don't see guys like this. I mean, okay, yeah, Marvin Harrison was able to be that light and, have that type of ability. But, are you really going to say this guy's the next Marvin Harrison? So there will be teams that would not draft him in the top 50. But I bet you there will be a team that drafts him in the first round. And I bet they'll be happy they did.
So you could tell by that conversation, it really looked like Smith was still in that late first round discussion. He wasn't really talked about yet as a top 10 or top 15 pick. And Dane mentioned the discourse around that profile, right? It was his size, speed. How dominant could he be? What was the upside? The film looked good. At times it looked great, but could he sustain it? Well, the rest of the season proved that he could do exactly that, and his stock continued to rise. Now, the next week after the Georgia game, Alabama squares off against Tennessee. Smith finished the game 7 catches, 73 yards. But the big news coming out of that win for Alabama was the ankle injury suffered by wide receiver Jalen Waddle, and the speed receiver likely to miss the remainder of the year. The Alabama passing game now is going to funnel almost entirely through DeVonta Smith. How is he going to handle it? Could he still succeed while being the guy that defenses had to stop on a weekly basis with no other proven threats around him? Well, he quickly put that question to bed. First game after Waddle's injury, Alabama faces Mississippi State. Smith explodes. 11 catches, 203 yards, 4 touchdowns. He ran a corner post route for one of those scores that I actually broke down in detail right here on the show. And that kind of quickly became a weekly theme. We talked about DeVonta Smith in some way, shape, or form, basically on a weekly basis from there on out. And the buzz just continued to build. That week, ESPN's Mel Kiper put Smith as the number 5 player on his big board, ahead of LSU wide receiver Jamar Chase. This was like sounding the alarm for all of NFL draft media that DeVonta Smith was going to be one of those top prospects in this class. And it was the kind of turning point for him because, he, again, was more of a bottom half of round 1 player. Now, moving forward, he was a top 10 consensus, top 15 consensus player in every mock draft from that point forward. But it wasn't just the NFL draft circle recognizing that Smith was beginning to get some of that buzz, because from a college football landscape, the buzz and the whispers were starting to build in support for Smith for some big-time hardware, and that became even more apparent when I spoke with The Athletic's Matt Brown, who does a great job covering the entire sport and helped me preview one of the top games of the week that week, Alabama against the defending champion LSU Tigers.
Certainly looking forward to the obvious matchup this weekend of DeVonta Smith and Derek Stingley. Stingley had his worst game last year as a freshman against Alabama. According to Sports Info Solutions, he gave up five catches for 211 yards, 2 touchdowns last year. This was a guy who wasn't All-American as a freshman, but kind of got burned by Alabama, and more specifically DeVonta Smith, who had 7 catches for 213 yards, 2 touchdowns in that game. I talked about Mac Jones earlier, but if I was voting for the Heisman in our staff poll at The Athletic last week, I voted DeVonta Smith number 1. Wow. I just think he's probably the best player on Alabama. And he's a guy who, everybody knew his name because he had the national championship winning touchdown against Georgia way back when, but he kind of fell. He was kind of overlooked then. Alabama had 2 top 15 picks at wide receiver last year in Henry Ruggs and Jerry Jeudy, and Smith still led the team in receiving yards. And it was like, well, a lot of teams are focusing on Jeudy. Maybe, DeVonta Smith isn't getting as much attention. And now we look at this receiving core. Jalen Waddle got hurt, and they still have talent there, but Smith is the guy. And without Jalen Waddle, he's had 203 yards against Mississippi State, 144 yards against Kentucky, 171 yards against Auburn. Those aren't necessarily all great teams, but those are good defenses. Yep. And he's absolutely destroying everybody. And so can't be more excited to see him go up against a guy like Stingley, who hasn't quite had the season, like LSU hasn't had the season anybody expected, dealt with an injury, but still really talented, still potential first-round pick when we talk about 2022. And this is the kind of matchup you just love to see, a receiver against cornerbacks.
the Heisman Trophy. That was the first time that I had heard that award mentioned with serious contention for DeVonta Smith, but it kind of encapsulated just how dominant he had been to that point in the season, as again, his name was being circulated as one of the top prospects in the entire country, regardless of position. So the LSU game happens, and once again, Smith crushed the Tigers. This time, the tune of 8 catches, 231 yards, and 3 touchdowns. He took the hearts of that LSU secondary in a dominant victory for the Crimson Tide. Following week here on the show, we did a special mock draft episode, and I selected DeVonta Smith for the team picking at 11 overall, who at the time was the Washington football team. The following week, over on ESPN, Todd McShay and Mel Kiper did a dual mock draft and actually mocked the Eagles to select DeVonta Smith at number 7 overall. We talked about that on the show. I'm not going to include every single one of these segments. Like I said, this would be a 4-hour episode if I played every single clip that we mentioned DeVonta Smith in over the course of the last year. But we talked about that mock draft from ESPN on the show. And that week, Alabama would go on to play Arkansas, and this would prove to be another easy win for the Tide. It was the least impressive line, though, in the box score for DeVonta Smith in the season. DeVonta Smith finished with just 3 catches for only 22 yards against the Razorbacks, but still, he was a focus on our show the following week because there was one big play that stood out to Dane Brugler in that game.
So I went with DeVonta Smith. I don't know if you guys have heard of this guy. Look, I know it. It seems like we talk about it every week. I get it. But this isn't repetitive because I'm talking about something he did on Saturday that he's never done before. And that's return a punt for a touchdown.
Yeah, right.
So with Jalen Waddle out, Smith started returning punts, and he's been electric. He had an 84-yard return for a score against Arkansas. And look, proving himself as a return man just only bolsters his case as a potential top 10 pick in this class. And hopefully it earns him a few more Heisman votes. I know it's a quarterback award, but we're talking about the best player in college football. DeVonta Smith certainly has an argument here. So, we talk about what he does on offense every week, but what he did on special teams just added to the resume.
Some predictive analysis there from the great Dane Brugler talking about one of Smith's most dynamic plays of the entire season there against Arkansas. Now, later that week on the show, I welcomed another ESPN analyst to the podcast in Dan Orlovsky, who's most known for his outstanding NFL analysis as the worldwide leader, but he also serves as a color commentator on Saturdays for college football. And so I brought Dan on to ask him about the players that he had seen up close over the course of the season. And one of the questions I had for him really stood out to me, and it was pretty open-ended. But here's what he had to say. Whoever you think of first when I say the term explosive, who is the guy that has most stood out to you this year?
DeVonta Smith. DeVonta Smith is absolutely spectacular. That will probably be the difference between him and Jamar Chase. In people's eyes, Jamar Chase coming out of LSU. DeVonta's got that explosive aspect to his game. And I look at explosion a little bit differently. I don't think of it as just straight line juice.
Yep.
Like his ability to be explosive off the line of scrimmage with his route running, his ability to be explosive in and out of cuts, his ability to be explosive when he's running step by step with a defender and the ball's in the air, and then the explosion to the football, whether it's a horizontally thing where he's trying to catch the ball horizontally or going back to the football, like that explosive aspect of his game. And so DeVonta Smith would be a guy that is super high when it comes to just who stood out to me when I got to watch them.
So I love that from Dan, who absolutely knows what NFL play speed looks like. And that's one of the things that stood out to me about DeVonta Smith. You've heard us talk throughout this show about how his time speed reportedly last spring was not that impressive at the Alabama spring timing day, right? But how many people have talked on this show just today about how that speed between the lines was a little bit different. We heard Dan talk there about the explosiveness in and out of breaks, that explosiveness late in the down as he was able to change speeds to track the ball downfield. We heard Tom Luginbill earlier talk about the explosiveness show up when there was somebody chasing him. All of that is play speed, and the difference between play speed and time speed. So those guys really painted that picture there. Great stuff there from Dan Orlovsky as always, and that was as the college football regular season came to a close. That weekend, Alabama would take on Florida in the SEC title game. The Tide rolled once again. Smith beat up the Gators. He had 15 catches, 184 yards, 2 touchdowns, big-time performance. Now, one of my favorite new games that we played here on the show this past season was called On the Clock, where every single week, Ben, Dane, and I would debate a different topic and make arguments for different players. Chris McPherson, C-Mac would come on as the judge, and whoever made the best argument each week got the W. At this point in the season, after Championship Saturday, we had a pivotal battle in our On the Clock series, and DeVonta Smith was the centerpiece of my argument, my most important debate that I would make of the year. Let's just update people on the standings. I've got 5 wins here. Dane's got 5 wins. Ben's got 4. It's about as tight as it gets at this point in the season. The topic today, who is worthy of the Heisman Trophy? Who should win the Heisman?
Wow. Okay.
We went back and forth here. I am going to get the number 1 pick. Dane will have the 2nd pick. Ben, who led us off last week, he will have the 3rd pick. And C-Mac, I'll kick us off here. And I'm going to go with a non-quarterback here. I'm going to go with Alabama wide receiver DeVonta Smith. All right. Now, look, only 3 receivers have ever won the Heisman. Right? I mean, this is not an easy argument to make, but I think when it comes to DeVonta Smith here in the year 2020, I think you could say, yeah, this guy is very much deserving. Not only is he the best player on the best team in the country, the number one, the best offense, the most explosive passing game, leads college football in receiving yards. He's got over 1,300 yards receiving in an only SEC schedule. So again, they didn't play anybody out of conference. They went only against conference opponents. He's got over 1,300 yards. He's second in the nation with 15 receiving touchdowns. And not only that, but he's also putting up scoring as a runner and as a punt returner. If you look back at the guys who have won the Heisman in the past at the receiver position, the last guy to do it, 1991. We're going almost 2 decades. Desmond Howard, and we know one of the most versatile players in college football that year. You go back to Tim Brown. You go back to Johnny Rodgers. They were the only 3 receivers to ever win the Heisman Trophy. And I think when you look ultimately at DeVonta Smith, he's put up enough of the resume that he's got the ability to be able to take home the hardware here in this season. Is a little bit of a weird year, but I think he's got the ability to do it again because of his running ability, because of the special teams value, which he proved 2 games ago. He caught the game-winning touchdown in the SEC title against Florida. He's got some of the best hands in the country. Ultimately, I think when you look at DeVonta Smith, yeah, you would say, oh, well, it's got to go to a quarterback. 9 out of the last 10 have gone to a quarterback. The only one to not do it, Derrick Henry, also from University of Alabama. The last guy to not be a quarterback to win it the year before Derrick Henry, Mark Ingram, another former Alabama guy. So if you're not a quarterback, you better be a skill position player from the Alabama Crimson Tide under Nick Saban. I'm going to put my money here on DeVonta Smith.
Can you go back? What was his performance against Florida in the SEC championship?
Ultimate numbers. I can grab that for you really quick. I know.
Or what was the mile? You know, what was his biggest play of the year? I guess. Did he have a clutch moment? Anything along those lines that would stand out to you?
I mean, he has had big time catches in just this past week against Florida, he had 15 catches, which was a season high for 184 yards and 2 touchdowns. He went for 8 for 231 and 3 touchdowns against LSU. That's probably an exclamation point performance, especially considering going up against LSU in the defending national champs. But I mean, almost every single week, he's putting up monstrous numbers. He's only had a couple games where he hasn't reached the century mark in the receiving category. To me, I don't know that I can name one specific Heisman moment, but he has just made ridiculous catch after ridiculous catch after ridiculous catch. To me, Smith, the best player in college football, and that's what the award is all about.
Would you say what was his worst performance of the season?
I would say his worst performance of the season, and this is strict box score scouting because we're going, I haven't watched every single rep of his yet from this year, but I would say, look, against Arkansas, he went 3 for 22. And ultimately, though, that was the game where he scored as a punt returner. And so, yeah, he didn't do it on offense in that game, but that's where he kind of showed off the versatility in special teams. So I would say that would be the line in the box score that isn't as sexy for sure. So I would go on to win that debate and win the entire season-long battle there, for what it's worth. Subtle flex on my part. But more importantly, DeVonta Smith did go on to win the Heisman Trophy. I'm not sure how much my argument helped him in the final standings, but he was able to take home the hardware, the first receiver in nearly 30 years to do it. Truly an awesome accomplishment for Smith. But it wouldn't be the only trophy that DeVonta Smith would take home last fall, though, because he also won the Maxwell Award as the top player in the country, the Fred Biletnikoff Award as the top receiver in the country, the Paul Hornung Award award as the most versatile player in the nation. The Walter Camp Offensive Player of the Year. He was named the unanimous All-American. He was first team All-SEC unanimously. He was the SEC Offensive Player of the Year. The list goes on and on and on and on. And if you thought he couldn't fit any more hardware on the shelf, he goes to the Rose Bowl against Notre Dame in the college football playoff semifinal, and he goes off 7 catches, 130 yards, 3 touchdowns, and he takes home the MVP in that game as well, something we discussed right here on the show after the game. I'll start with the Rose Bowl in Alabama Notre Dame. I would say this one went about as we expected. We expected Alabama to roll, and they did. And DeVonta Smith, we expected him to continue to show out, and he did. He was outstanding once again. I mean, the guy just continues to post up ridiculous numbers. His abilities at the catch point are just bananas. I mean, he is so automatic. He plays the ball really well in the air. There's the difference between ball skills and hands. I feel like that's lost sometimes with people in evaluating receivers, is the difference between those areas. And ball skills to be able to attract the ball, address the football in the air, play it, going up and fighting in a crowd. And then the hands is the actual catching of the football. He's A+ in both. He is just outstanding at going up and winning. The route running is good, is solid, and the ability to create separation, that's all well and good. He's able to create yards after catch. We saw him on special teams in this game. That kind of speaks to his toughness and his football character as well. But to me, DeVonta Smith, what else can you say? He was the offensive player of the game once again. In this one, he was outstanding against Notre Dame.
Compassionate and trusted care, clinical expertise. It's the cornerstone of NovaCare Rehabilitation and why they're the leading provider of physical therapy throughout the Delaware Valley. Don't let aches and pains or any injury slow you down. Schedule an appointment today at NovaCare.com. The Philadelphia Eagles choose NovaCare, so can you. NovaCare, the power of physical therapy.
So Alabama moves on to the national title game against Ohio State. They play 10 days later, and Smith continued to rip it up. 12 catches, 215 yards, 3 more touchdowns. He wins the Offensive MVP award for the game. It was an exclamation point on his career in which he broke several Alabama school records. He set the SEC record with 46 career touchdown catches. He set the SEC record with 3,965 receiving yards in his career. Just an awesome career, one that we may never see again at the college level. I recently caught up with Smith's offensive coordinator for those last 2 years at Alabama, and Steve Sarkisian, who since then has been hired as the head coach at Texas. We talked over on the Eagle Eye in the Sky podcast recently, and he spoke about a number of things, but we talked a lot about DeVonta Smith. And one of the first questions I asked him, at what point during this 2020 season did he think it could be a truly special year for DeVonta Smith? And then we talked a little bit more about his skill set as a player and what he will bring to the Eagles and to the NFL. Obviously, just a legendary season this past season for you guys over at Alabama. At what point did you realize that this had to be the potential to be, an all-time season for an individual at wide receiver?
I don't know if there was one point, quite frankly. Smitty, as I refer to him, he was really steady Eddie for me for 2 straight years. Probably the biggest game that jumped out to me was his junior year. We were playing Ole Miss at home. Was just a monster game of touchdown catches and yardage. And then when we got into his senior year, you almost took for granted 135, 140 yards and a touchdown or 2 in the game. I was like, ho-hum. I think probably the game that stood out the most this year was going back to LSU and him being home in front of his family. Just a few spectacular plays in the first half. Obviously, the one-handed catch right there in the back of the end zone, in front of his dad, standing literally right there in the stands. I thought it was a very cool moment for him. But just a tremendous year, and the consistency was just incredible that he brought week in and week out.
Coach, one thing that stands out to me watching your offense's function is just he's always on the move and everything, just creating opportunities for him to create those yards after catch. I feel like that will be this case here in Philadelphia, talking with Coach Nick Sirianni and the way that they want to function, but watching whether it was those quick in-breakers, those glance routes, just getting him the ball on the move, and then you just see him be such a long strider in space. What were some of the things that you guys talked about as a staff to try and create those opportunities for him?
Well, early on, we're a big motion offense, I think, in general. And when we had he and Waddle kind of going at the same time, it was we had a really pretty good 2-headed monster. When Waddle went out, we really recognized, okay, everyone's got to stop number 6. I kind of just reverted a little bit back to my time in Atlanta when I had Julio Jones, knowing double coverage was going to come. How do you keep trying to find ways to help get this guy open, force miscommunication amongst the defense, and then, provide opportunities for explosive plays? And Smitty bought into it. He really embraced it. He went for it. He knew the game plan inside and out. He knew where we wanted him and why we wanted him there. And then he knew the complementary plays off of the plays that we had kind of in our openers. And so his understanding of the plan was great. His preparation was tremendous. And then ultimately, his playmaking ability. I mean, it comes down to ultimately we're in a production-based business. You have to make your plays when your number's called. And he did it at a high level.
He's a guy that, the ball is never on the ground with him. Was that always the case? I know you weren't necessarily there with him when he first arrived on campus, but was that always the case with him when you had him in Alabama?
Since I got there, he's got elite hands. He's got a huge catch radius. He's got really long arms. He's got tremendous body control when the ball's in the air. But he is that guy at the end of every practice is on the jugs machine. He puts in the work. He does not take it for granted. He puts in the work, and I think that's a sign of a high-level competitor and a high-level performer.
And then the last question for you, just you mentioned the wide receivers having to win one-on-one. I feel like even still in today's game, we talk about, an X receiver is this, it looks like this, a Z looks like this, a slot looks like this. With you guys, you lined up DeVonta everywhere in the formation. You lined up all those guys everywhere. How important is it to have that level of positionless football at the receiver position?
Well, I think it's big. For us, we really don't teach by position. We teach by concept.
Yeah.
And from week to week, we try to put the best players in position to be successful based on the concept, based on the coverages that we might anticipate getting. And I think DeVonta was a great example of that. I literally could have played him just about at any position. Outside the fact that he can't throw, he knew the reads almost from the quarterback perspective as good as Mac. He knew where the ball should go based on the coverage that we were getting. And he was obviously at a very high level. But when we can teach that way, now we're not putting guys just isolating them in one position, that they can play at all spots on the field.
And there were even clips, Coach, where I'd be watching him on film, and you could see him motioning to the tight end, hey, get up on the ball. You're gonna get a flag thrown on us. Just having a full understanding of what everybody is supposed to do offensively.
Without a doubt, his football IQ is very, very high. I would say I've never talked to a player, especially non-quarterback player, more on the sidelines than I did with DeVonta. He is very aware, very attuned, can tell you exactly what he sees. He doesn't make things up. If he doesn't know, he'll tell you, but is very attuned to what the defense is trying to do and can communicate it really well.
Just awesome stuff there from Coach Sark. And you can catch that entire interview over on the Eagle Eye in the Sky podcast, wherever podcasts can be found. Now, in January of 2020, DeVonta Smith made an announcement that shocked the college football world when he said he was going back for his senior season. A year later, as we sit here at this point in the timeline, this January, he did it again, this time announcing that he was going to go to the Senior Bowl after many assumed that he was not going to make that trip to Mobile. Now, Smith could not participate due to a hand injury he had suffered in the title game against Ohio State, but he would have the opportunity to meet with teams face-to-face, something he wouldn't be unlikely to do at any other point during the pre-draft process due to COVID-19 protocols. One of those teams he met with was the Philadelphia Eagles. And you heard the Eagles, whether it was Howie Roseman, Andy Weidel, Nick Sirianni, they talked about that at his post-draft press conference, that interview at the Senior Bowl, and how important that was for him. So the Senior Bowl comes and goes. Like I said, DeVonta did not participate in practice due to that hand injury. And with the Eagles sitting with the number 6 pick, DeVonta Smith's name was very, very popular amongst Eagles fans for that selection. Really, it was pretty much a three-man race, it seemed, between him, Kyle Pitts, and Jamar Chase. In our draft mailbag segment, I answered question after question after question and looked at fan mock draft after mock draft after mock draft every single week that mocked DeVonta Smith to the Eagles. And in our mock draft roundup segment, Ben Fennell and I were constantly breaking down mock drafts that had the Eagles selecting Smith at number 6 overall. As all this was happening, we started our weekly segment with NFL Film senior producer Greg Cosell, who was starting to go through college tape and had thoughts on how some of these top prospects in the country would transition to the NFL. I caught up with Greg and asked him how he thought DeVonta Smith would make that jump.
To me, and again, I actually got his numbers from, I guess, last summer when scouts went down to Alabama. I spoke to a scouting friend of mine, and he was 6 feet and a quarter and 174, and that was over last summer. He's a long, thin, silky smooth, linear strider. He has a vertical dimension with his ability to eat up ground and get on top of corners. I think he's a strider. When he can work freely into his routes, he can threaten defenders with his stride. I think that he's deceptively sudden and explosive. He's, again, not a 4.38 kind of guy, but he's a very, very easy accelerator. He has tracking ability, body control, really good hands. He can make contested catches at his size. I think he's got a feel for how to set up corners. He's got a sense of refinement to his game. I would just be concerned, and maybe this is cliched in the minds of some, but I would be concerned about the 174. The 174 pounds is really, really light, and I think that's a legitimate question. Now, the great thing which you and I do is we watch full games, and there were numerous snaps where he lined up at boundary X, which I don't believe he is in the NFL, where he was physically pushed and squeezed to the sideline. And this showed up both in his 2019 and 2020 tape. I see him more as a movement Z or a slot in the NFL.
Yeah. To me, I think if you look at a kind of scheme that he were to go to where they were able to kind of protect him off the line. I can remember a quote, when you look at Cooper Kupp, and I'm not comparing DeVonta Smith to Cooper Kupp, but Cooper Kupp, the big question with him is, hey, can he get off a jam? Can he get off a jam?
Right.
He couldn't do it at Eastern Washington. Can he get off a jam? He couldn't do it at the Senior Bowl. Well, then he goes to the Rams, and guess what they never asked him to do? They never asked him to beat a jam early in his career. And you get him out, that's the second level. And I feel like, if you can do that with DeVonta Smith, get him the ball in space, get him up free access, that kind of a rate mitigates that. So the beauty is going to be in the eye of the beholder there, I think, in terms of teams that are saying, look, we're not going to ask him to be that guy. So maybe we're not as worried about that, but it's going to be a team-to-team thing, right?
It's funny you say that, because here's what I typed in my transition. My sense is Smith transitions most effectively as a movement Z and slot, at his best with free access off the line to open his stride and maximize both his vertical traits and his run after catch traits.
Yep.
So I think we see that the same way.
So Greg gave his thoughts there on DeVonta Smith, and I'm sure you're starting to notice that theme, right? Everybody raves about DeVonta Smith, the football player. The lone question that analysts had was the size. And it was around this time when Jim Nagy, who runs the Senior Bowl, tweeted out an anecdote from his days as a scout with the Kansas City Chiefs back in 2012 when they discussed Russell Wilson in draft meetings. And here's the quote from Jim. So while working for the Chiefs 9 years ago, our college director posed this question about Russell Wilson in final draft meetings. What don't we like about this guy besides his height? Jim said, guessing the same question was being posed in draft rooms right now about DeVonta Smith's weight. Yeah, the room was crickets to this Wilson question, as I'm sure it is with the Smith question. It's a unique debate. Just like the Wilson debate was an interesting one. But it's clear that whatever question you had about the physical profile of DeVonta Smith, there was no questioning the mental makeup and the football character, the competitive toughness. That was further evidenced by just an outstanding quote that we shared right here on the show. It was from an article written by the great Bruce Feldman over at The Athletic, and it was an anonymous quote from a college coach about DeVonta. Here's the quote and our discussion afterwards. And that was going back to DeVonta Smith, and I loved this quote from this anonymous coach. So here's the quote. He doesn't drop a ball ever. The most impressive thing, though, is after each series, he'd come to the sideline and tell their coaches they did this and this and this. He really knows coverages and what defenses are trying to do. Our guys came back to the sideline, and he's calling out what we're playing and telling their sideline what our coverages are and how we're playing our man coverage. God almighty, that's different. So I love that from DeVonta Smith. And you're talking about what is it that can help set him apart? Hey, if he's 170 pounds, if he's 165 pounds, and he runs in the low 4.5s, how can he set himself apart? Having that kind of that kind of mental edge certainly is something that he can, and that's not a tangible quality. That's not something that is going to show up on every scouting report in terms of the traits you're looking for at the receiver position. But I think that does speak certainly to his football character. That I thought was a really interesting nugget.
And I'm kind of looking down the road 4 or 5 years, and when we're then going to look at receivers in similar size as DeVonta Smith. And we're going to say, could he be the next DeVonta Smith? DeVonta Smith was an outlier. He was a rare player.
Yeah.
Those types don't grow on trees. And I think the more you dig into him, the more you talk to people around him, you just realize how rare he is. I think we're out of the conversation of comps and fits and styles.
That's a tough one.
He's a unicorn.
Yeah.
I'm not sure it's ever existed. I'm not sure it's going to exist again. Will it exist on paper? Height, weight, speed? Absolutely. He's 5'10", 175 pounds. Those guys are all over college football. But what he's bringing from a mental makeup, off the field, on the field, production, every level of the defense, he is a rare breed. And this is just another element to, his ability as a prospect.
So that all brings us to draft day. And as the Eagles sit with the 12th overall pick, everyone in Philadelphia and Eagles everywhere sat and waited. How would the top 10 play out? How many quarterbacks would go early? Who would fall to number 12? Well, as expected, quarterbacks go 1, 2, 3 off the board. Kyle Pitts goes number 4 to Atlanta. The first two receivers then go, with Jamar Chase and Jalen Waddle going 5 and 6. At number 7, the Lions take the stud tackle and Penei Sewell out of Oregon. Then, in a bit of a shakeup to round out the top 10, the Panthers and Broncos at 8 and 9 respectively take the two top corners, J.C. Horn and Patrick Surtain. That leaves the Dallas Cowboys on the clock at 10 overall, with both of the cornerbacks gone as their presumed targets. The window was there to make a move, and the Eagles did exactly that.
The Dallas Cowboys have traded the 10th pick to the Philadelphia Eagles. With the 10th pick in the 2021 NFL Draft, the Philadelphia Eagles select DeVonta Smith, wide receiver, Alabama.
Really excited to get DeVonta Smith. He's very highly rated on our board. Someone who we feel like is not only a great player, but a great person, and will come in and be ready to roll. We talked about it through this draft process about getting guys in here who could help us build the type of culture we want. We had a plan that we talked about, and we had a list of guys that we were really targeting in this draft. And with the amount of picks that we had, the flexibility we had because of the picks, we felt like it was important to get one of those guys, and that's why we made the trade up to go get him. I think when we made the trade from 6 to 12, we really had to make a list of guys that we would have been really happy to take at 12. I think that from March to draft day, a lot has changed. I think that, at the time, maybe we thought there would be more quarterbacks, to be honest with you, going before we picked. And at the same time, we also had to project what would go in front of us and what we thought would go in front of us. And we talked about it. We talked about it with Dave on our site that as much as we look at the mock drafts, even more importantly, we make sure that we do our board and we have 12 players that we really like. And DeVonta was standing out on our board, his grade, the type of player he is, the type of person he is. And so we just want to make sure that we got him. We really just think he could be a difference maker on and off the field for our football team.
So this was something that was always in the cards for the Eagles, the flexibility to go up and make that move. They knew that there was a chance that the Giants could take DeVonta Smith in 11. And look, if you at home listen to our pre-draft expert mock draft extravaganza, you may remember that Zach Rosenblatt, who covers the Giants for NJ.com, had the Giants selecting DeVonta Smith, citing those connections between Joe Judge and Nick Saban, how the Giants really like DeVonta Smith's talent. So what do the Eagles do? They make sure they go get their guy. They move ahead of New York to make the pick. And as Eagles VP of Player Personnel Andy Weidel explained to Dave Spadaro after the selection, the Eagles executed a well-laid-out plan.
Well, it was calm. We were following the board, and DeVonta Smith was a player that, we really liked. And we saw him there and had an opportunity, and credit to Howie, for pulling the trigger and getting a deal done. And we ended up getting a player that we're really excited about to add to our team.
It's interesting because the pre-draft talk was about how the trades that you made and the draft picks that you acquired would give you the options to make moves up or down. So all of that pre-planning really did pay off.
It sure did, and it was one of the things we talked about, when we discussed the opportunity with Miami trading back, and it was having the extra picks and the opportunity, the flexibility to do that, to go up or down, and it came to fruition. And like I said, credit to Howie for making the trade, pulling the trigger, and getting us in a position to draft a player DeVonta Smith's caliber.
Despite the fame and the success, there has not been a ton written about DeVonta Smith. There haven't been many pieces or interviews that have really dug into him as a person and his mindset as a football player and really what he's like off the field as well. That's why I really enjoyed this part of his sit-down with Dave Spadaro when he arrived here in Philadelphia, where you really get a sense of his mentality both on and off the field.
The mental aspect of it, and then my attention to detail in my route running. I'm out of my game after Devontae Adams and Keenan Allen, so watching them, seeing the things they do, and then me, that's just the type of receiver I am. I want to be the one that runs the precise routes to get open. That's just my style of play.
Are you ever in a situation where you look back and you look at the sheer numbers of what you produced at Alabama, and you go, wow, they were some incredible years?
I kind of like put it to the side, but my mentor, after the season, though, we were just talking. He was like, man, like, you had over 100 catches. Like, don't nobody do that. And, like, it ain't really hit me. And I was like, that is crazy, like, 100 catches. I was like, I remember freshman year, I think I had, like, 8. And I was like, I went from 8 to 100 catches. Like, that's crazy.
It's unbelievable. And it just seemed like it was natural to you the whole time?
When you play receiver, that's your job, get open and catch the ball. So, I mean, yeah, it felt natural. I mean, that's what I was there to do.
What did defenses try to do to you to take you out of the offense? Jalen Waddle's on the sideline. You know, there's a lot of weapons in Alabama. But if I'm a defense, I'm saying, I got to stop DeVonta Smith. I'm going to do everything I can to stop DeVonta Smith.
It was a lot of bracket coverage, a lot of drop 8, just dropping everybody, just letting the run game beat them. But, I mean, like, whether you dropped 8 or you just played cover 1, I mean, it wasn't a good idea. You drop 8, we just going to run the ball. You play cover 1, then we just going to go over top. So, I mean, it was kind of advantage for us because no matter what you do, you're always wrong.
Wide receivers have to have the mentality that nobody can stop me. I'm on an island. You seem like a very humble guy, very grounded. When you're on the field, do you think that anybody can stop you?
In my head, that's how I think. I don't show it, but 100% in my head, I go out there feeling like can't nobody stop me. But you'll never see me broadcast that. But I mean, like, when I'm on the field, I'm just a different person. I mean, off the field, I'm quiet, but on the field, it's just a whole different me.
I love it. I thought that was awesome. And you can go check out both of those interviews from Dave, both on PhiladelphiaEagles.com, as well as on the Eagles Insider podcast, where Dave gets exclusive interviews just like that all the time. You can find it wherever you get your podcasts. All right, the last bite I want to throw to here on DeVonta Smith's journey comes from his new head coach. The question was posed to Nick Sirianni on the night of the draft. How would he fit in the offense? And as he typically does, Coach gave a great answer that really speaks to his offensive philosophy.
As far as just where he fits in the offense, I think if you would look at any offense that I've been a part of for the past 8 years, we move our guys around all over the place. So to say he plays F in the slot, to say he plays the X, he plays the Z, yes, he'll play all of those things, right? Because we move our guys around, the guys how we want to get them the ball. And what I saw in DeVonta was just a guy who can consistently win one-on-one. All right, it's a little different with how he does it. All right, he does it with speed. He does it with quickness. He does it at the top of the route. He does it at the beginning of the route, off the line of scrimmage. But I consistently saw him win one-on-one versus some of those top corners in the SEC. And when you have a guy like that in your offense that can do that, it makes everybody else around him better, right? The quarterback can go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, hitch, throw. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, hitch, throw. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, hitch, throw, and get the ball out of his hands, right? So it makes that, and when it's a one high safety look, he can just play football with him over there. It takes the read out of it a little bit. What that does to the offensive line, the ball's out of the quarterback's hands quicker, right? So he has that ability to win one-on-one that we like so much. He's a long strider. He's and fast, as we've all seen with his tape, and to be able, we throw a lot of crossing routes in our offense, and you can just see some of the guys in our past that we've had that can run away from the defense. He has that part of his game as well. He has very good yak ability, just easy touches to get the ball out of the quarterback's hands and into his hands, and he showed that in a very competitive league, obviously. And what Andy said, the guy does the major requirement of the position is you catch the football, right? That's the major requirement. You got to be able to do that, and he does that exceptionally well. Not only when Bodies are around him when the ball's, no matter where the ball is, it seems like he has a knack to go get it even when bodies are around him. So super impressed with a lot of things that he can do. And, we see a lot of different ways that he can fit our offense.
I'm going to be honest. I loved this quote from Coach Sirianni because to me, this matches up beautifully with, number one, the way he was used at Alabama, but also, number two, it matches up well with what many analysts have said about the best way to use DeVonta Smith. Remember, we talked with his coach, Steve Sarkisian, earlier, and he talked about how they moved Smith around. He played every position. We heard from anonymous scouts and coaches in multiple articles talking about him having that skill set, and even hearing Greg Cosell talking about how DeVonta Smith best transitions as a movement player in the offense. This meshes perfectly with exactly what Nick Sirianni said after the draft, and I think it's the perfect fit in the offense. DeVonta Smith could not have landed in a better place, and that's why I'm excited about this selection. I cannot wait to see him take the field here as a Philadelphia Eagle. If you're an Eagles fan and you listen to this whole podcast, I hope you enjoyed it. If you haven't already, make sure you go hit that subscribe button. You could hear all this analysis as it happened throughout the course of the calendar year. We are talking all about not just the top players, but all the players across the country. And you're going to find that out over the next couple of weeks because we're going to have podcasts just like this for all of the Eagles draft choices. Now, not all of them are going to be as thorough as the Heisman Trophy winners, right? So next week, we're going to go through the journeys of both Landon Dickerson and Milton Williams. Following week, we're going to go through the journeys of all the Eagles' Day 3 selections. And again, those are going to be a little bit different than this one, but you're still going to get that same level of analysis and insight from a lot of voices that are close to a lot of these prospects and, of course, some analysis in between. So stay right here to the Journeys to the Draft podcast presented by Life Brand. We will talk to you next week. We've got more coming from all around the 2021 NFL Draft. Download the official mobile app of the Philadelphia Eagles. Catch breaking news, see real-time stats, watch live or on-demand video clips, listen to Eagles podcasts, and so much more. Now you can stay in touch with the Eagles anytime, anywhere.